The military aircraft carrier flight deck buzzed with controlled urgency until General Harrison's impatience reached its breaking point. "Clear non-essential personnel, Commander Davies," he commanded, irritation clear in his voice. The unremarkable woman in maintenance coveralls stood quietly near the aircraft when the lead pilot collapsed, and she performed one action that changed everything. The effect was immediate. The flight crew's equipment clattered to the deck. Senior officers froze at their monitoring stations, and faces drained of color throughout the facility. No one had expected a maintenance worker to take control of a fighter jet. No one had expected the quiet woman dismissed as non-essential to save the lives of everyone on board. No one had expected the truth. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story captivated you, please consider subscribing. We share powerful stories of unsung heroes every week. The aircraft carrier flight deck hummed with the constant roar of jet engines and shouted commands. Banks of monitoring equipment cast harsh light across focused faces, illuminating flight schedules dotted with red weather warnings and yellow maintenance alerts. The air carried the scent of jet fuel and salt spray, mixed with the tension that came with launching aircraft in deteriorating weather conditions. It was 1,400 hours on what had begun as a routine afternoon mission aboard the USS Constellation, cutting through rough seas off the coast of Japan. Maintenance Specialist Third Class Jessica Chen stood at her assigned aircraft service area, deliberately unremarkable in her standard blue coveralls and regulation safety equipment. Her black hair was tucked under a maintenance cap, no visible identification except for her work badge. Late 20s, with a focused face that spoke of technical competence rather than aviation ambition. Her dark eyes moved constantly between aircraft systems and flight preparation activities, while her presence demanded nothing from the urgency around her. To a casual observer, she might have been any technician, a recent transfer from civilian maintenance perhaps, or another face in the endless rotation of support personnel. She occasionally made notes in a standard maintenance log, her handwriting neat and precise. Unlike the pilots and senior NCOs who filled the flight deck with their flight suits and aviation credentials, she wore no visible markers of pilot training or flight experience. Just a mechanic, it seemed, with basic clearance and an assignment to service aircraft systems. The flight operations underway involved an urgent transport mission carrying high-priority intelligence personnel to a classified meeting in South Korea. The mission had proceeded through standard phases, pre-flight inspection, crew briefing, and now final preparation despite deteriorating weather conditions with storm systems approaching the carrier. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez, a veteran naval aviation coordinator with something to prove, managed the launch procedures with practiced efficiency, moving between aircraft and checking status displays throughout the flight deck. The weather conditions had created challenging launch parameters, Rodriguez explained to the air boss, his voice carrying over the engine noise. The decision to proceed with the mission despite storm warnings created complications for standard flight procedures. General Harrison stood rigid at the flight operations console, his face a careful mask. A decorated Air Force officer with 30 years of service, he looked somehow troubled in his dress uniform, as if the weight of the classified mission had physically aged him in recent hours. Jessica watched it all, her expression revealing nothing. Only the occasional glance toward the aircraft cockpit suggested any emotional response to the ongoing preparations. When the air boss called for a personnel update, heads turned in mild surprise as Jessica raised her hands slightly from her position at the service area. Maintenance Specialist Chen has been conducting final systems checks, Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez announced. She may have additional technical assessment of aircraft readiness. She moved toward the aircraft with a deliberate precision that seemed at odds with her maintenance role. Something about her bearing, spine straight, steps measured, chin level, caught the attention of a silver-haired naval captain seated near the main display. He frowned slightly, studying her with newfound interest. General Harrison, sharp-eyed and methodical, watched her with narrowed attention as she prepared her technical assessment. The general was known for his no-nonsense approach to flight operations and mission security. Today, he wore his authority like a burden, his dress uniform crisp despite the afternoon weather. "Please state your technical findings for the record," instructed General Harrison. Maintenance Specialist Third Class Jessica Chen Aircraft Systems Specialist, she replied. Her voice was soft but clear, her technical bearing professional. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez began his questioning, and Jessica's responses were factual and precise, but delivered in such a measured, quiet tone that General Harrison soon grew visibly impatient. Several times, the operations recorder had to ask her to repeat her statements. Specialist Chen, General Harrison finally interrupted. The entire flight crew needs to hear your technical assessment clearly. Please speak up. Yes, General, Jessica responded, barely raising her volume. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez continued. Specialist Chen, can you explain your assessment of the aircraft's readiness for this mission? I've been conducting standard systems verification and monitoring flight preparation according to established maintenance protocols, she replied, her voice still frustratingly soft. I've identified several factors that affect flight safety based on current weather conditions. And what were your findings during systems checks? I determined that the aircraft systems respond normally to standard operational parameters. I also noted significant weather factors that indicate potential flight safety considerations. Did you document these observations? Yes, I logged all systems responses and attempted weather impact assessment through available meteorological data. Was this analysis reviewed by flight operations? It was not forwarded beyond my immediate maintenance supervisor. The flight safety officer, Major Patricia Voss, approached for additional questioning with a skeptical demeanor. Tall and imposing with steel-gray hair that lent her an air of authority, she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to challenging questionable technical assessments. Specialist Chen, what specific aviation training qualifies you to analyze flight safety considerations? I completed basic aircraft systems training during my maintenance specialist program. And what level of flight experience? Her tone suggested the answer would confirm Chen's limitations. I maintain appropriate technical certification for aircraft maintenance personnel, Jessica responded evenly. Major Voss smiled thinly. Specialist Chen, how could you possibly understand the complexities of flight operations and weather impact assessment when you've been servicing aircraft for only 4 months? Something flickered across General Harrison's face. A brief shadow of recognition quickly suppressed. He studied Jessica more intently now. Objection to characterization, Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez called out. Specialist Chen's technical assessments should be evaluated on merit. Sustained, General Harrison replied, his eyes never leaving Jessica. Major Voss adjusted her approach. Let me rephrase. What specific flight experience do you have with weather operations in naval aviation environments? Jessica paused before answering, her eyes briefly meeting those of the silver-haired naval captain near the main display. My background includes some practical application of flight systems analysis, she said carefully. Could you be more specific? That information involves previous assignments that may not be relevant to current maintenance requirements. Major Voss looked to the commanding officer. General, if the specialist lacks relevant flight experience with weather operations, her safety assessments should be considered accordingly. I'll allow the line of questioning, General Harrison ruled. Specialist Chen, please provide more detail about your relevant experience. Jessica's expression remained neutral. My previous flight experience involves classified maintenance programs. How convenient, Major Voss remarked dryly. So we're expected to trust your flight safety assessments without knowing your actual qualifications to evaluate weather operations? I'm reporting on technical observations I made using established maintenance protocols. As the questioning continued, Jessica responded with increasingly precise details about flight systems, weather impact procedures, and aviation protocols that made several flight officers on the deck exchange glances. She referenced specific aircraft configurations, weather systems, and safety measures that seemed beyond the knowledge base of a standard maintenance specialist. When shown weather radar displays, her eyes lingered on them a moment longer than necessary, her composure wavering almost imperceptibly before returning to professional detachment. Do you recognize these weather patterns, Specialist Chen? Major Voss asked. Yes, they represent the storm systems I've been monitoring for flight safety assessment. And your analysis of these conditions proved to be, what exactly? The weather observations you made about flight operations, how does that affect current mission parameters? Jessica's voice remained steady. The weather assessment I conducted indicated storm conditions that weren't reflected in current flight evaluations. My observations about safety protocols were documented in my maintenance reports. On the flight deck, the older naval captain with silver hair and multiple deployment ribbons watched Jessica with growing intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration as if trying to place a half-remembered voice from flight briefings. The afternoon hours passed as Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez returned for follow-up questions, asking Jessica about specific technical requirements for the current mission. Can you explain the standard protocols for launching aircraft in deteriorating weather conditions? Rodriguez asked. The flight crew would have established primary and secondary safety parameters with operations control, she explained, her voice still frustratingly soft. Standard protocol requires verified weather assessment and safety confirmation at predetermined intervals. And if those parameters were compromised or exceeded, the backup protocols would proceed using alternative flight procedures after primary safety was assessed, utilizing specialized weather protocols on confirmed navigation systems. She explained with a level of technical precision that raised eyebrows among the flight crew present. General Harrison leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. Specialist Chen, I've asked you repeatedly to speak up. This flight deck cannot properly evaluate technical assessments it cannot hear clearly. I apologize, General, Jessica replied, her volume barely increasing. The older naval captain on the flight deck now sat forward at his monitoring station, his eyes never leaving Jessica's face. Recognition seemed to be dawning slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to alarm. Major Voss seized on the general's frustration. Perhaps Specialist Chen's reluctance to speak clearly reflects her limited confidence in her own technical assessments. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez stood immediately. Ma'am, that's inappropriate speculation. Noted, Rodriguez. General Harrison replied sharply. Major Voss, confine your remarks to relevant questions for the specialist. Major Voss nodded in acknowledgement. Specialist Chen, in your assessment as a maintenance professional, was there anything about the weather conditions that indicated modified flight requirements? Jessica looked directly at the main weather display for the first time. The meteorological assessment suggested storm conditions beyond current safety estimates. That wasn't my question. Based on what you observed, should flight procedures have been modified? Based on the weather patterns I identified, yes. But my assessment was not included in flight planning. Major Voss's expression hardened. Are you suggesting that technical information was deliberately ignored by flight operations? I'm stating that the weather analysis I provided differed significantly from the safety assessment that was distributed to flight personnel. The flight deck stirred with murmurs as storm winds began to increase. General Harrison tapped his clipboard once against the console, restoring order. Specialist Chen, General Harrison said, his voice tight with growing impatience. You'll need to explain that assertion clearly and audibly for the flight crew. What specifically was different about your analysis? Jessica paused, her eyes scanning the flight deck briefly before returning to the general. When she spoke, her voice remained soft, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear. My weather analysis indicated that the storm systems included conditions using patterns normally associated with severe turbulence and wind shear. That information was not included in the safety briefing provided to flight personnel. General Harrison's head snapped up, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time. The silver-haired naval captain's expression darkened as he studied Jessica with new intensity. Specialist Chen, General Harrison said firmly, frustration evident in his tone. This is the final time I will ask you to speak louder. The entire flight crew must be able to hear safety assessments accurately. Jessica looked directly at General Harrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the general quickly masked it with professional detachment. The veteran naval captain on the flight deck was now gripping his monitoring station, his knuckles white. General Harrison finally interrupted with visible impatience, leaning forward at his operations console. Specialist Chen, we don't have all afternoon. Clear the flight deck of non-essential personnel, or we'll proceed without additional maintenance input. The flight deck felt tense. For the first time since beginning her assessment, Jessica looked directly at General Harrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the general quickly masked it. The silver-haired naval captain near the weather display leaned forward, his hands gripping his monitoring station. Suddenly, as the storm intensified and the aircraft prepared for launch, The lead pilot collapsed on the flight deck, overcome by a sudden medical emergency. With no backup pilot immediately available and the aircraft loaded with critical personnel, Jessica moved swiftly to the cockpit. Despite General Harrison's earlier dismissal of her as non-essential, she took control of the aircraft and expertly guided it through the violent storm, executing a perfect landing on the pitching carrier deck in conditions that would have challenged the most experienced pilots. The effect was immediate and electric. General Harrison's clipboard fell from his hands, clattering loudly on the deck. Several flight crew members physically straightened at their stations as if witnessing something impossible. Major Voss's face drained of color. The silver-haired naval captain near the weather display stood up involuntarily, then slowly sat back down. Complete silence fell over the flight deck as recognition dawned across various faces. Some looked confused, others shocked, and a few, those who understood the significance of what they had just witnessed, appeared stricken. Jessica continued in her normal soft voice, but now everyone was straining to hear. I could land that aircraft because I was the test pilot for the Navy's Advanced Weather Operations Program 3 years ago. I was also the flight instructor attached to the Storm Riders Squadron, which General Harrison personally coordinated 2 years before my flight status was revoked and classified. She methodically produced a worn, waterproof flight case from her coveralls and held it up for the flight crew to see. This contains classified flight records from the Storm Riders program, not the sanitized reports filed with Naval Aviation. I'm not just a maintenance specialist. I'm Commander Jessica Chen, and my flight status was revoked after I refused to falsify weather safety reports that would have endangered pilots. General Harrison attempted to call for order, but found his voice failing him. Specialist Chen, this is highly irregular procedure for flight operations. My flight status and I were declared invalid after Storm Riders was disbanded, Jessica continued calmly. I was the only pilot who refused to comply with falsified safety standards. I've spent 2 years working under reduced rank and waiting for another situation where flight safety was being compromised, not for personal reasons, but to prevent other pilots from dying because of the same administrative corruption that destroyed my squadron. A younger flight technician near the aircraft systems looked up in confusion. This is impossible. Commander Chen was stripped of flight status for insubordination. I processed naval personnel actions myself. The silver-haired naval captain turned to address him. Stay at your station, petty officer, he said quietly. Look at that landing. Maintenance specialists don't fly naval aircraft through storm conditions. Jessica opened her flight case to reveal pilot certifications, flight records, and classified documentation. My flight status was revoked because I discovered Admiral Rebecca Stone was pressuring pilots to accept unsafe weather conditions to maintain mission schedules. The same pressure that led to 3 aircraft losses before the Storm Riders program was terminated to cover up the safety violations. The flight deck erupted into controlled chaos. General Harrison tapped his clipboard repeatedly against the console, finally restoring some semblance of order. His face had lost all color, and his hand trembled visibly. This flight deck will pause current operations for 20 minutes, he declared, his voice unsteady. But before anyone could move, Jessica spoke again. With respect, General, those intelligence personnel made it safely to their destination because someone ignored your dismissal and saved their lives. I've waited 2 years to speak. But flight safety shouldn't be compromised for administrative convenience. General Harrison slowly leaned back against the console, his authority visibly shaken. He nodded once, a gesture of reluctant acknowledgement. The Storm Riders program was classified above top secret, Jessica continued. Our mission was to develop advanced weather flight techniques for operations in extreme conditions. We created safety protocols and navigation procedures for flights that conventional wisdom said were impossible. What we discovered was that Admiral Stone was pressuring squadron commanders to ignore our safety recommendations to maintain unrealistic mission schedules, leading directly to pilot fatalities. She turned her flight case and removed an encrypted data chip. This contains flight test data, safety recommendations, and communication records. We filed these reports before the program was terminated. Those recommendations were buried and our safety protocols were declared operationally impractical to avoid implementing expensive safety measures. Major Voss stood, her voice hollow. I received direct confirmation from Admiral Stone that Storm Riders pilots were being reassigned due to performance issues. The program was terminated due to budget constraints. We weren't underperforming, Jessica said simply. We were refusing to fly unsafe missions that would have killed more pilots. I heard your voice on the command frequency, Major Voss. You sounded confused when you relayed the program termination order. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez approached Jessica cautiously. Commander Chen, if what you're saying is true, how did you end up as a maintenance specialist? And why accept reduced rank for 2 years? Jessica's composure never wavered. I chose maintenance duty over discharge because it kept me close to flight operations where I could monitor safety compliance. By the time the administrative review was complete, the official story was established. Storm Riders was a failed program. The pilot fatalities were due to pilot error, and Admiral Stone had been promoted to fleet command. She looked around the flight deck, meeting the eyes of several senior personnel. I needed time to gather evidence that couldn't be easily buried again. I needed to understand who knew about the safety violations and who was simply following compromised orders. Most importantly, I needed to make sure no other pilots would die because of the same administrative pressure to ignore safety protocols. The silver-haired naval captain approached the central operations area. General, request permission to address the flight crew. I am Captain David Patterson, retired naval aviation. I was the safety officer for the Storm Riders program. He turned to face Jessica. Commander Chen was one of the finest test pilots I ever worked with. If she says safety protocols were being ignored, I believe her without question. Major Voss interjected. This is all highly dramatic, but it has no direct bearing on current flight operations. Weather conditions require operational flexibility, not rigid adherence to excessive safety protocols. They're connected, Jessica replied. The pressure to ignore weather safety recommendations in today's mission reflects the same administrative mindset that killed 3 pilots in Storm Riders. Current operations are proceeding with compromised safety standards. History repeating itself. Different missions, same pressure, same source. She pulled another document from her flight case. This is a safety report showing that Storm Riders pilots filed weather safety concerns directly to Admiral Stone 8 times before the fatal crashes. We were told explicitly that questioning safety parameters would compromise critical mission requirements. We weren't being difficult. We were trying to save lives. General Harrison studied the document, his command demeanor cracking further. These safety reports weren't included in the operational briefing I received about today's mission parameters. Because they were deliberately removed, Jessica said, just like current weather assessments are being modified to support unrealistic mission schedules. And just like the safety recommendations were removed from Storm Riders after the program was terminated. The flight deck had grown absolutely still despite the storm conditions. Every person present was aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the flight technicians had stopped their routine monitoring, staring at Jessica with undisguised astonishment. Flight Operations Officer Rodriguez approached the operations console. General, in light of this new information, I recommend immediate review of weather safety protocols and potentially revising current mission parameters. General Harrison nodded absently, his attention still fixed on Jessica. Granted, all flight operations will implement enhanced safety review immediately. He paused, then added, Commander Chen will be restored to full flight status pending resolution of these matters. As crew began coordinating the operational changes, Jessica spoke again. There's something else you should know, General. She removed a final document from her flight case. This is the original authorization for Storm Riders with your signature from when you served as aviation liaison. And this, she produced another paper, is the program termination order that ended our safety work. The authorizing signatures don't match. General Harrison took both documents with trembling hands. Someone forged my signature on the termination order, he whispered, shock evident in his voice. Yes, Jessica confirmed. You've been carrying responsibility for a decision you never made. The termination order came directly from Admiral Stone's office. The retired Captain Patterson moved closer. I always questioned why you would terminate that safety program, Harrison. It didn't align with anything I knew about your aviation philosophy. General Harrison looked up, visible emotion crossing his face. I've spent 2 years believing I made a call that ended crucial safety research and contributed to pilot deaths. I authorized the program liaison, but I never authorized terminating the safety protocols. The flight deck communications crackled, and a team of naval investigators appeared, led by a stern-faced full captain. What is the meaning of this flight safety alert? The captain demanded. General Harrison, I'm Captain Patricia Foster from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. We received an anonymous intelligence package yesterday containing evidence of serious violations of flight safety regulations involving Admiral Stone and mission scheduling pressures. I understand there may be connected evidence being reported on this flight deck. Jessica smiled faintly, despite the storm conditions around them. Right on schedule, she murmured. Captain Foster approached her. You would be Commander Chen, formerly of Storm Riders. I would be. We have extensive questions for you, Commander. Starting with how you maintained evidence and why you accepted reduced rank. And I have answers, Captain. 2 years' worth. The captain turned to address General Harrison. With your permission, I'd like to take custody of the evidence Commander Chen has provided and arrange for her protection pending a full investigation. General Harrison nodded. Granted, but I want to be kept fully informed of any evidence relating to current flight safety and potential administrative misconduct. Of course, General. It appears several ongoing operations have been compromised by the same administrative pressure. The flight deck began to clear of non-essential personnel, but Major Voss remained at her monitoring station, looking shell-shocked. Jessica approached her quietly as the storm continued around them. I don't understand, Voss said, looking up at her. Why would you risk everything? I'm the one who relayed the termination order that ended your program. Because you were another victim of the same administrative pressure, Jessica replied simply. You followed what you believed were legitimate orders from a trusted superior. The responsibility should rest with those who created the pressure, not those who were forced to implement it. How can you be so certain I wasn't involved? Jessica allowed herself the smallest of smiles, glancing at the aircraft she had just landed safely. Because I've spent 2 years studying every detail of what happened. I know who created the pressure and why. I know who altered safety reports and who benefited from reduced safety budgets. Most importantly, I know you requested clarification twice because you suspected something was wrong with the termination order. Major Voss's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Those communications were classified. I had help, Jessica admitted. Not everyone in naval aviation was compromised. There are still good people within the system who wanted flight safety to be prioritized over administrative convenience. As she prepared to leave with Captain Foster, the retired Captain Patterson approached. Commander, he said formally, then dropped his voice. Jessica, we held a memorial service for the Storm Riders pilots. I spoke about your dedication to flight safety. I know, she replied quietly. I read the transcript online. Thank you for honoring their sacrifice. What happens to flight operations now? Jessica looked at the weather displays showing current storm conditions, then at the aircraft she had safely landed. Now they proceed with honest safety assessments and proper weather protocols. Pilots can fly safely because someone finally told the truth about administrative pressure. The flight deck remained suspended in a moment of shocked revelation despite the ongoing storm. General Harrison slowly stood from his operations console and removed his aviation insignia, setting them on the console before stepping down to stand on the same level as Jessica. This command recognizes Commander Jessica Chen, unjustly reduced in rank, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, he announced formally, his voice carrying a weight of regret and respect. The retired Captain Patterson approached Jessica and rendered a perfect salute. Others throughout the flight deck followed suit, a ripple of silent acknowledgement spreading through the crew. Flight personnel who had moments ago regarded her with skepticism now stood at attention, honoring a fellow aviator whose integrity had cost her career. Major Voss, visibly shaken, stood to address Jessica directly. I never knew who actually gave that termination order. I've been carrying this responsibility for 2 years, believing I contributed to ending important safety work. I know, Jessica replied. Your voice on the command frequency that day. I heard your uncertainty. You questioned the order. Twice, Voss confirmed, her voice breaking slightly. They told me I was risking mission effectiveness by questioning administrative decisions, that the safety concerns had been addressed through other channels. General Harrison's professional demeanor cracked as he turned to face the flight crew. I authorized Storm Riders liaison based on flight safety research that indicated critical aviation improvements. I did not authorize the termination order that ended the program. The signature was forged. You've been living with responsibility that was never yours to bear, Jessica confirmed. Admiral Stone used your administrative authority to cover her own pressure to reduce safety expenses. Captain Foster stepped forward. General Harrison, I'd like to request a formal review of current flight operations while we secure this evidence and establish proper protocols for what happens next. This has implications for multiple ongoing missions and potentially dozens of personnel. General Harrison nodded. Current operations will continue with enhanced safety protocols, but all flight safety procedures will be immediately reviewed for potential compromise. He paused. Major Voss, in light of the evidence presented, you are relieved of any responsibility for the Storm Riders incident pending complete review of the circumstances. As naval investigators began securing the flight deck and escorting people to debriefing areas, Jessica opened her flight case and carefully displayed photographs showing Admiral Stone meeting with budget administrators and defense contractors focused on cost reduction rather than safety. This was never about career advancement, she said softly, addressing the crew at large as the storm continued around them. It was about preventing other pilots from dying because of administrative pressure, and about making sure flight safety serves pilot protection rather than budget convenience. As she descended from the aircraft area, her shadow stretched long behind her across the flight deck, the shadow of a pilot standing at attention rather than a maintenance specialist servicing aircraft. For a moment, she paused to look back at the weather displays showing current storm conditions and the aircraft she had safely landed. The flight crew was coordinating with proper safety information for the first time in years. General Harrison was directing operations with restored confidence in his safety systems. Major Voss was working to identify other potentially compromised procedures. Captain Patterson watched her from near the operations console, his face reflecting a complex mix of pride and determination. Jessica gave him a small nod before continuing toward the exit with Captain Foster, while storm winds continued around the carrier. Her mission wasn't quite complete. There would be extensive debriefings, naval investigations, and probably congressional oversight. The full scope of the administrative pressure would need to be exposed, and those responsible held accountable at every level. But the most important part was accomplished. The truth was out, and pilots could once again trust that their safety systems were working to protect them rather than serve budget priorities. As she reached the flight deck exit, a naval security officer approached. Commander Chen, Captain Foster has arranged secure quarters for your continued protection. If you'll come this way. She followed the officer toward the exit, conscious of the eyes following her progress. Flight crew, maintenance personnel, operations staff. For 2 years, she had lived with reduced rank, unremarkable and unnoticed, gathering evidence while pretending to accept administrative demotion. Now she walked openly, her rank restored, her purpose fulfilled. The older veteran caught up with her just before she reached the exit corridor. Commander, he said quietly, what you did, maintaining your integrity, preserving the evidence, coming forward at the right moment, it was extraordinary. I had a duty to the pilots who died and to those who fly after us, she replied simply. It was more than duty, he insisted. It was courage of the highest order and flight safety work that saved lives. Jessica allowed herself a small smile, looking back at the storm-tossed flight deck. You taught us well, Captain. I taught you procedures and protocols, he corrected. What you demonstrated today, that came from within. He watched her leave with the investigative team, then turned to General Harrison, who had joined them. Some heroes never get the recognition they deserve, he said quietly. They just carry the weight of protecting others. General Harrison nodded, watching Jessica's figure disappear down the corridor while storm conditions continued outside. And some truths are worth waiting years to hear. The afternoon storm continued as Jessica's escort team moved to secure quarters aboard the USS Constellation. Behind her, the flight deck buzzed with renewed purpose as naval operations moved forward with proper safety protocols and adequate weather assessment procedures. The flight crew worked with restored confidence, knowing their safety assessments would reach command personnel without administrative pressure to compromise standards. Ahead lay the challenge of ensuring complete justice was served and that the full scope of the administrative pressure was exposed and eliminated. But for now, in this moment between what was hidden and what would be revealed, The simple act of speaking truth had transformed a routine flight operation into something profound. The power of one pilot's quiet determination to honor fallen comrades and protect those who came after, even when it meant sacrificing years of her career to gather the evidence necessary to expose administrative pressure that powerful forces had tried to maintain forever. As her escort reached the secure quarters, Jessica's radio crackled with an update from the flight deck. All safety protocols have been restored to full implementation. Investigation proceeding with complete transparency. Jessica closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in 2 years, knowing that this time, flight safety would be prioritized over administrative convenience, and no more pilots would die because of budget pressure.